Stand up and leave that chair, Emily. The woman who deserves to occupy the place beside my son is already here, and you will collect your belongings before dessert arrives. Come closer, Claire, and take a seat. This cannot be happening. What a scandal. The main dining room of the Whitmore estate, on the outskirts of Madrid, became so silent that the sound of a glass being set on the tablecloth seemed like a gunshot. Victoria Whitmore held one hand on the back of Emily's chair and extended the other toward Claire Foster, who waited behind Alexander with a smile as flawless as the jewels around her neck. Emily had stumbled when her mother-in-law pulled the chair away without warning, but she managed to steady herself by pressing her fingers against the table. Not one of the 30 guests made the slightest move to help her. Others watched the scene with merciless curiosity, as though the humiliation of a woman were the true entertainment of that dinner held in memory of Mr. Richard. Alexander remained seated, motionless, his face rigid and his eyes fixed on his plate. Victoria did not merely take away Emily's seat. She smoothed the tablecloth with deliberate slowness and declared that the table was reserved for true members of the family, not for a woman who had arrived at the estate without a name, without a fortune, and without a single share in the company. Then she took Claire by the arm and led her to the place beside her son like a queen, presenting her as the heiress she had always wanted. Claire pretended to hesitate. She murmured that she did not wish to cause trouble, yet she sat down without waiting for permission. Beneath the table, her hand went searching for Alexander's. Emily noticed. She also noticed that he did not pull his hand away. To discover what secret could shake a family that considered itself untouchable, stay until the end of this story. Portraits of 4 generations of Whitmores hung on the walls, men in dark suits, women in pearls, and children taught to inherit before they learned to love. At the center of the room stood out an oil portrait of Mr. Richard, who had died exactly 1 year earlier. His severe, vivid gaze seemed directed at Emily. She pressed her worn brown leather handbag against her chest, its corners scuffed, the same bag Victoria had mocked the moment she arrived at the estate. Inside rested a thick envelope sealed with blue wax and delivered by a messenger from the Sawyer notary office 40 minutes earlier. The instruction had been exact. She could not open it until all the Whitmores were gathered. Emily still did not know why Mr. Richard had anticipated that night, but she did know the envelope weighed more than a simple document. "Do not make that martyr's face," Victoria continued, raising her voice so the guests at the opposite end could hear every word. "You have spent 3 years living under our roof, using our name, and spending the money my son earns. At least today, you could have the decency not to ruin an important evening." A murmur traveled around the table. Aunt Margaret pretended to adjust a napkin. Cousin Grant hid a smile behind his glass, and 2 shareholders exchanged uncomfortable looks. Emily searched Alexander's face for a reaction, the slightest sign of shame, but he took a sip of wine and avoided looking at her. That cowardice hurt more than Victoria's cruelty. An insult from her mother-in-law was expected. Her husband's silence was a choice. "Mother, that is enough," Alexander finally said, although his tone did not defend Emily. It merely tried to prevent a greater scandal. "Let us not do this in front of the guests." Victoria gave a dry laugh and replied that it had to be done precisely in front of everyone, because rumors were already circulating through Madrid, and the family needed to make its position clear. Claire lowered her head with studied modesty, but she did not remove her hand from Alexander's. Emily felt something break inside her, not loudly, but with the final calm of a door closing. For months, she had endured absences, midnight calls, and unfamiliar perfume on her husband's shirts. That night, for the first time, the betrayal stopped hiding. "Away from this table," the matriarch replied. "Martha can prepare something for you in the kitchen, if you are still hungry." Several people held their breath. Martha, the elderly housekeeper, stood frozen beside the doorway, with a silver tray in her hands. She knew Emily's story too well to endure the scene, but 35 years of service had taught her that in that house, the truth always paid a price. Emily looked at her for only a second and gently shook her head, preventing her from intervening. Then Victoria signaled the young butler to remove the empty chair. The young man stepped forward in embarrassment, but before he could touch it, a male voice sounded from the entrance hall. "That chair does not move, until the last will of Mr. Richard Whitmore has been read. Everyone turned at once. Jonathan Sawyer appeared in the doorway with a black briefcase in one hand and a notarized folder in the other. He was 60 years old, with carefully combed gray hair and the sober expression of a man who had spent his life entering rooms where families tore one another apart over money. Victoria went pale, a change so brief that almost no one noticed it, almost no one except Emily. Alexander rose abruptly and demanded to know why his grandfather's attorney had appeared without being invited. Jonathan replied that he needed no invitation to carry out a testamentary instruction. Then he swept his gaze over the table, paused at Claire seated beside Alexander, and finally looked at Emily's handbag. "I see the envelope arrived on time," he said. Emily felt a shiver, carefully removed the envelope, and placed it on the table in front of the plate that no longer belonged to her. The blue seal bore the intertwined initials R.W. Victoria reached for it, but Jonathan stopped her with a single sentence. The addressee was Emily Carter, and no one else had the right to touch it. That precision ignited a new kind of silence. Grant stopped smiling. Margaret leaned forward. One of the shareholders, Mr. Lawrence, adjusted his glasses to see more clearly. Claire kept her face composed, although her fingers tightened around her glass. Alexander looked at his wife, as though he were discovering that he had spent years living beside a stranger. "What is inside?" Emily asked. Jonathan answered that he did not yet know. He asked for the dining room doors to be closed. Martha obeyed. The sound of the wooden panels fitting into place seemed to isolate them from the outside world. The attorney then explained that Mr. Richard had left a special provision connected to the anniversary of his death. It was not a symbolic ceremony or a sentimental letter, but a legal instruction whose execution required the presence of the direct descendants, the principal shareholders, and Emily. Victoria recovered part of her arrogance and insisted that the will had already been read months earlier. According to that document, Alexander inherited executive leadership. She retained the family voting rights, and the personal assets were divided among the grandchildren. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened the briefcase and replied, "That was a provisional will." The word provisional fell upon the table like a stone. Alexander frowned and demanded an explanation. Jonathan said that 2 weeks before his death, Mr. Richard had signed an amendment before a notary, with 2 independent witnesses and a medical certificate confirming his full mental capacity. The final document could not be revealed until certain conditions were met. One of them was that Emily personally receive and open the envelope during the first anniversary dinner. Victoria struck the table with her palm. She accused the attorney of manipulating a sick old man and claimed that no amendment could be valid without the family's knowledge. Jonathan looked at her with almost compassionate calm. That is precisely why Mr. Richard decided the family must not know about it beforehand. Emily ran her thumb over the wax seal but did not break it. Something in Jonathan's gaze asked her to be patient. Victoria, meanwhile, began pacing around the table like a caged animal. She said Emily had taken advantage of Richard's illness to fill his head with lies, disguising herself as a devoted caregiver for the sole purpose of receiving a reward, and that her present silence was proof of calculated ambition. Emily raised her eyes. "If I had wanted money, I would have accepted any one of the checks you left on my bed," she replied. A louder murmur spread through the room. Alexander turned toward his mother. Victoria denied it immediately, but Martha lowered her eyes. The lie had just found a witness. Victoria demanded that Martha leave the dining room. Jonathan objected. Every employee named in Richard's instructions had to remain available. The matriarch asked contemptuously when a servant had become part of family matters. Martha, trembling, lifted her head and answered, "Since the day the members of this family left Mr. Richard alone in the hospital so they could attend a gala." Emily felt an old pain as she remembered that night. Rain had fallen heavily. Alexander had promised to return within an hour, but he did not come back until the following morning, accompanied by Claire, with photographs from the gala filling the society pages. Richard had suffered a respiratory crisis at midnight. Emily was the only person who held his hand when he believed he was going to die. Alexander approached Emily and lowered his voice, although everyone could hear him. He asked her to hand over the envelope before opening it, arguing that anything connected to his grandfather had to pass through him first, as the company's director. Emily looked at the man with whom she had shared 3 years of marriage. She remembered his first promises, the small church in Segovia, and the way he swore he would never allow his mother to humiliate her. Now he stood before her, not as a husband, but as an executive, concerned about a document. "It is not a company file," Emily said. "It is addressed to me." Alexander clenched his jaw. "You are still my wife. Whatever you receive may affect both of us. What you have done affects both of us too," she replied, finally looking at Claire. The accusation hung in the air. Claire slowly withdrew the hand she still kept near Alexander's, but it was too late. Emily pointed out the brushing of their fingers, the shared glances, and the ease with which the mistress had occupied her chair without the slightest surprise. She asked how long they had been planning that public presentation. Alexander said it was not the appropriate moment, but Victoria answered for him. She said Claire represented the future. She came from a respected family, had international connections, and could bring capital into the company. Emily, by contrast, could offer nothing. "You have not even been able to give him a child," she added cruelly. The color drained from Emily's face. Only Martha knew that 2 years earlier she had suffered a miscarriage while Alexander was in Brussels, and Victoria had forbidden her from calling him during a negotiation. Jonathan closed his eyes for an instant, as though even he needed to contain his outrage. Emily did not cry. She had cried too much in rooms where no one could see her. She buried the pain behind a slow breath and asked Alexander whether he agreed with his mother's words. He took several seconds to answer. The delay was enough. At last, he said their marriage was going through a crisis, that they both knew it, and that he could no longer keep pretending in front of the family. Claire looked away with false humility. Victoria smiled, convinced Emily's defeat was complete. Then, Alexander added that he had intended to discuss divorce after dinner. Emily looked at Richard's portrait and understood that the old man had chosen that date because he knew the masks would fall once everyone felt safe. "Then let us speak with complete honesty," Emily said. "I am not here to preserve a marriage you have already buried. I am here because Mr. Richard asked me not to miss tonight." Victoria burst into laughter and asked how a dead man could invite her to dinner. Emily raised the envelope. She explained that during the final week of the old man's life, he had made her promise to attend the first anniversary, even if no one wanted to see her. He had not explained why. He had only said that a moment would come when she would have to choose between leaving in humiliation and remaining on her feet until the truth found a voice. Victoria again accused Emily of inventing conversations that could not be proven. Jonathan opened the folder and displayed a signed copy of that declaration. Richard's signature was unmistakable. Victoria refused to ask Claire to stand. She said it was her house and that she decided where each person sat. Jonathan opened another sheet and pointed out that the estate was not registered in Victoria's name, but remained part of Richard's undistributed personal holdings. Until the final reading, no one could claim ownership of it. Alexander glared at the attorney. Emily, meanwhile, looked at the empty chair on the other side of the table, near the old man's portrait. Without arguing, she walked over and remained standing beside it. "I do not need to sit down to hear the truth," she said. Martha discreetly placed a chair behind her, but Emily rested one hand on the back and did not sit. That silent stance made several guests begin to see her differently. Mr. Lawrence, a shareholder for more than 20 years, asked whether the testamentary amendment affected control of the company. Jonathan replied that he could not reveal its contents in advance, but confirmed that Richard's personal shares, which represented the decisive block in the group, were part of the final provision. Alexander went pale. Victoria stopped pacing. Claire leaned toward him and whispered something Emily could not hear, probably a strategy, a threat, or a promise. Dinner no longer mattered. The food grew cold, the candles burned down, and the wine remained untouched. Everyone watched the envelope as though a weapon lay inside it. Emily then understood that the family did not fear what Richard might have given her. They feared what he might reveal about them. Jonathan approached Emily and explained the procedure. She had to break the seal, remove the contents, and first read any handwritten instruction. If she found a key, a code, or a reference, she was to give it to him so they could continue. No one could interrupt her or leave the room until the first phase was complete. Victoria protested, but 2 security officers from the notary's office appeared in the entrance hall, discreet and firm. The matriarch realized Richard had anticipated even her attempt to stop the reading. Emily finally sat in the chair Martha had placed far from Alexander, far from Claire, and far from the place she had believed was hers for years. She set the handbag on her lap and held the envelope with both hands. The blue wax cracked beneath the pressure of her thumb. Before opening it, Emily looked at every person around the table. In Margaret, she saw curiosity. In Grant, greed. In Martha, painful loyalty. In Claire, calculation. In Alexander, a mixture of guilt and fear. In Victoria, she found something darker, the certainty that actions committed behind closed doors could return in the form of documents. Emily remembered her final afternoon with Richard. He had barely been able to speak, but he had written a sentence on a sheet of paper and handed it to her folded. Family is not the person who sits beside you when there is wealth, but the person who remains when there is nothing left to divide. At the time, Emily had thought it was a farewell. Now she understood. It was also a judgment. "Open it already," Victoria ordered, unable to endure the wait. "If my father committed the madness of leaving you a jewel or a sum of money, you will take it and disappear from our lives. Everything else belongs to Alexander." Jonathan closed the briefcase with a dry click. "Mr. Richard will decide that, not you." Alexander took a step toward Emily, but the attorney raised a hand to stop him. Claire murmured that the entire thing was absurd, and that a woman with no business experience could have no connection to the group's future. Emily looked at her without hatred. 10 minutes ago, you occupied my chair because you believed I had nothing," she said. "Perhaps you should ask yourself why everyone is frightened of what a dead man chose to place in my hands." Emily finally broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in Richard's trembling hand, a small safe deposit key, and a card bearing the emblem of a private bank in Madrid. At the sight of the key, Victoria stepped back half a pace. Jonathan noticed. Martha did too. Emily unfolded the first page. At the top appeared her full name, Emily Carter Bennett. Beneath it was a sentence underlined twice. "Read this aloud before allowing anyone to decide where you belong again." The entire dining room held its breath. Emily raised her eyes toward Richard's portrait, then toward the woman who had expelled her from the table, and with a firm voice that no longer trembled, she began to read the will of the man everyone had believed incapable of defending her. 3 years before that dinner, Emily Carter did not yet know the weight of the Whitmore name, or the price some people were willing to pay to preserve it. She worked at the Madrid Historical Archive, restoring old letters with edges scorched by time and family ledgers no one else knew how to read without damaging them. Her world smelled of paper, vegetable paste, and clean dust. She lived in a small apartment near Lavapié, traveled by subway, and sent part of her salary to her mother, who still lived in Toledo. She met Alexander during a private exhibition about Spanish companies, founded after the war. He arrived surrounded by advisors. She came wearing white gloves, a folder held against her chest. Alexander stopped in front of a century-old account book and asked whether something so badly deteriorated could be saved. Emily answered that almost anything could be saved, if action was taken before the damp reached the center. That sentence was the beginning. Alexander began visiting the archive with increasingly unconvincing excuses. First, he asked for information about family documents. Then he brought coffee. Eventually, he waited for Emily at closing time and invited her to walk through Retiro Park. Beside her, he did not seem like the heir to a real estate empire, but a man tired of everyone measuring his words according to money. He told her about Victoria, his mother, about the pressure to prove he deserved to lead the group, and about his fear of becoming a copy of his father, who had died too young and too alone. Emily did not try to impress him. She told him fear did not disappear with a larger company, but when a person stopped living to fulfill other people's expectations. Alexander looked at her as though no one had ever spoken to him that way. He fell in love with her honesty, and Emily believed she fell in love with the man who existed away from boardrooms. When Alexander announced that he wanted to marry her, Victoria requested a private meeting at the Whitmore estate. She received Emily in a room far too large for two people, with the curtains closed despite the sunshine. She did not offer her a seat. She asked how much Emily earned, what property she owned, and whether her mother had debts. Emily answered calmly, although each question sounded less like curiosity and more like an interrogation. Victoria finally placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a check large enough to buy an apartment. She said it was not a bribe, but an opportunity to withdraw with dignity before making a mistake. Emily returned the envelope unopened and replied that she had not come to negotiate the price of her feelings. Victoria smiled with perfect coldness. "Every woman has a price," she said. "Some simply need more time to admit it." From that day on, she decided Emily was an enemy. The wedding took place in a small church in Segovia because Emily did not want a ceremony turned into a corporate exhibition. Mr. Richard was the only Whitmore who seemed to enjoy it sincerely. He was 78 at the time, walked with a cane, and retained a gaze capable of silencing an entire table. During the reception, he asked to dance with the bride as they moved slowly among the guests. He told her the family smiled better when photographers were nearby. Emily thought it was a joke, but he added that she should observe who treated her with respect when Alexander was not present. "That is how you will discover who sees you as a person and who sees you only as a piece on a board," he murmured. Victoria interrupted the dance before the song ended. That night, Alexander promised he would never allow his mother to humiliate Emily. She rested her head on his shoulder and believed love could be a sufficient wall. The first months were peaceful. Emily continued working at the archive and returned each afternoon to the estate, where she tried to grow accustomed to formal dinners, employees calling her ma'am, and rooms where everything seemed inherited. Mr. Richard began seeking her company. He showed her boxes of letters, photographs, and old corporate records. He wanted to organize the history of the group before he died, but he distrusted the consultants Victoria had hired. Emily agreed to help him on weekends. She discovered that the old chairman was not merely a hard businessman. He had financed housing for employees, forgiven family debts, and preserved letters from workers thanking him. She also discovered that many of those decisions had disappeared from the official version Alexander and Victoria presented to investors. Mr. Richard used to say that a company without memory eventually began to believe profit justified any betrayal. Everything changed when Mr. Richard suffered a mild heart attack during a meeting. The doctors recommended reducing his activity and moving part of his care to the estate. Victoria arranged nurses in shifts, but rarely entered his room for more than 5 minutes. Alexander visited his grandfather after returning from the office, always with reports under his arm and questions about pending authorizations. Emily was the only person who sat beside him without asking for anything. She read newspapers to him, organized his medication, and accompanied him to appointments. When one of the nurses resigned, Victoria suggested that Emily temporarily leave the archive. According to her, a Whitmore wife had no need for a modest salary. Alexander insisted it would only be for a few weeks. Emily agreed because Richard's condition had worsened and because she believed her sacrifice would be recognized. No one warned her those weeks would become years. At first, Alexander thanked her for her devotion. He embraced her when he came home late and promised that once his grandfather's health stabilized, they would travel together and she would return to her profession. But the company began consuming him. Mr. Richard had surrendered executive duties, and Victoria pushed her son to occupy the empty space. Every success seemed to make Alexander more distant. He began correcting Emily's clothes before dinners, asking her to speak less with certain partners, and showing discomfort whenever she mentioned her former work. If Emily asked when she could return to the archive, he answered that the family needed her. If she pointed out that she also needed a life of her own, Alexander said she did not understand the pressure of directing thousands of jobs. Little by little, the man who had admired her independence began treating her as a silent extension of his name. Victoria took advantage of that transformation. In front of Alexander, she praised Emily for caring for Richard. In private, she called her an improvised nurse and reminded her that she ate because of family money. She left a second check in Emily's bedroom drawer, this time accompanied by a confidential separation proposal. Emily tore it up and returned it. Days later, Victoria implied over lunch that her daughter-in-law had left her job because she had never possessed ambition. Alexander did not correct her. Emily felt the first true crack in her marriage. That night, she asked him why he allowed those lies. He replied that arguing with his mother only created problems and that Emily had to learn to ignore her. She understood that the promise made in Segovia had not broken all at once. It wore away each time Alexander chose the comfort of silence. It was during that period that Claire Foster appeared. She arrived at the group's headquarters as the representative of an investment fund based in Barcelona, with offices in London. She was brilliant, elegant, and knew the company's figures better than many executives. Victoria received her with a warmth she had never shown Emily. At business dinners, Claire spoke of international expansion, luxury hotels, and aggressive acquisitions. Alexander felt admired beside her. She celebrated every decision, laughed at his jokes, and repeated that he was destined to surpass Mr. Richard. Emily met her during a reception at the estate. Claire greeted her with flawless courtesy, but when she learned Emily had left her profession to care for the grandfather, she remarked that some women were born to accompany, while others were born to lead. Victoria smiled. Alexander pretended not to hear. Mr. Richard fell silent. That same night, he asked Emily to take him to his study. There, he showed her a report about the Foster Fund. It contained clauses that allowed the fund to demand personal guarantees if the group failed to meet certain targets. Richard suspected the investment was a doorway for controlling the company from within. Emily asked why he did not warn Alexander. The old man replied that he had already tried, but his grandson confused warnings with attacks on his authority. He asked her to examine several old minutes, not as an economist, but as a conservator, capable of detecting substitutions, added pages, and reproduced signatures. Emily found differences in the paper used in 3 recent agreements. Someone had replaced appendices after the documents were signed. Richard remained silent for a long time, and finally said ambition had entered the family, dressed as opportunity. Alexander began traveling with Claire to close deals. At first, he called every night. Then he sent brief messages. Later, he left his phone switched off. Emily continued caring for Richard, sleeping only a few hours and enduring Victoria's insinuations. One morning before dawn, while tidying her husband's study, she found a gold button beneath the sofa. It did not belong to any of her clothes. 2 days later, she saw a photograph of Claire in a business magazine wearing a jacket with identical buttons. One was missing near the cuff. Emily put the piece in a drawer, still unable to face what it meant. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. Yet when Alexander returned from Barcelona, his shirt carried a perfume Emily had smelled during the reception. He pulled away when she tried to embrace him and said he was exhausted. Suspicion stopped being merely pain and became a question. How much of her life was being built behind her back? Emily watched more carefully. Claire appeared at family meetings that did not require her presence. Victoria invited her to lunch even when Alexander was away. One afternoon, Martha saw the 2 women reviewing plans of the estate and discussing a future renovation of the master bedroom. When she told Emily, she did so with embarrassment, as though afraid of destroying something already broken. Emily decided not to confront them yet. Mr. Richard was growing weaker and depended on her. She also needed to know whether Alexander still possessed anything of the man she had known, or whether the betrayal was part of a larger plan. The answer came during a charity dinner he had promised to attend with her. Alexander never appeared. In the newspapers the next day, Emily saw him entering a hotel with Claire. Emily carried the magazine into the bedroom and left it open on the bed. Alexander arrived after midnight, looked at the photograph, removed his jacket, and said, "Journalists distorted every professional meeting." Emily showed him the button. For the first time, he lost control and asked whether she searched through his belongings. She replied that she did not need to search for anything when the evidence appeared inside her own home. Alexander denied having an affair, but did not explain why Claire had been there. He ended by accusing Emily of becoming obsessed because she no longer had a job or a life outside Richard's illness. Those words struck her with cruel precision. He was using against her the very sacrifice he had asked her to make. Emily did not shout. She picked up the button, closed the magazine, and slept in another room. The following morning, Mr. Richard found her preparing medication with swollen eyes. He did not ask what had happened. He merely said that a woman's sadness became dangerous when everyone grew accustomed to seeing her endure it in silence. Emily tried to smile, but he took her hand and asked her never to confuse patience with obedience. Then he revealed that Victoria and Alexander were pressuring him to sign a transfer of shares under the argument that they needed to protect the company during his illness. Richard refused because the terms favored the foster fund. He also suspected that part of the family foundation's money was disappearing. Emily wanted to alert the authorities, but he replied that he needed evidence, and that any premature complaint would allow the guilty parties to destroy it. The truth is not enough, he said. It also needs a safe place in which to survive. During the following weeks, Emily helped Richard examine boxes of documents no one else knew existed. In one ledger, they found repeated payments to a consulting firm connected to Claire's father. Several minutes contained authorizations attributed to Richard on days when he had been hospitalized. Jonathan Sawyer was summoned to the estate under the pretext of updating medical powers of attorney. Victoria tried to remain in the meeting, but Richard demanded privacy. Emily withdrew as well, although before closing the door she heard the old man ask the attorney to prepare a new testamentary provision. He mentioned no names. He only said, control of the company had to remain in the hands of someone who understood that protecting a legacy was not the same as possessing it. From the hallway, Emily felt afraid. She did not imagine those words had anything to do with her. She assumed Richard was trying to prevent Alexander from selling the group. Victoria, however, had remained beside the adjoining library and heard part of the conversation through an old ventilation grill. She caught the words new will, personal shares, and trusted person. She did not hear the beneficiary's name because Richard lowered his voice. That uncertainty frightened her more than an answer. That same night, she called Alexander and told him his grandfather was losing his mind. She asked him to accelerate the transfer of authority before an outsider took control of the company. Alexander asked whether she meant Emily. Victoria replied that a woman capable of giving up her job to install herself in a wealthy house was capable of anything. He did not defend her. Claire, who was beside him during the call, suggested finding a doctor willing to certify that Richard was no longer capable of making decisions. A few days later, Richard suffered a relapse. While he was being taken to a private clinic, Victoria ordered Emily to remain at the estate so she would not interfere. Emily disobeyed and followed the ambulance with Martha. At the hospital, she saw Alexander signing documents beside Claire, not in the medical wing but in a room reserved for meetings. When she asked what was happening, her husband replied that they were urgent company formalities. Richard was sedated but conscious. He opened his eyes when he heard Emily's voice and squeezed her hand twice, the signal they used when he could not speak. She understood that he was frightened. That night, Alexander left for an investor's gala with Claire. Emily remained beside the bed until dawn, listening to the irregular sound of the monitor and wondering how many betrayals could hide behind a word as respectable as family. At 4 a.m, Richard recovered enough strength to ask for paper. He slowly wrote 3 words, "Do not trust them." Then he added an address and Jonathan Sawyer's name. Emily placed the note inside her handbag. Before she could ask anything more, Victoria entered, accompanied by a man who introduced himself as a notary. He carried a folder and avoided looking at Emily. Victoria ordered her to leave because they were going to discuss private matters. Emily refused until Richard, with an almost imperceptible movement, squeezed her hand twice again. She understood that he wanted her to pretend to obey. She withdrew into the hallway but did not go far. Through the door, she heard Victoria say they needed only one signature to protect Alexander. She also heard the false notary assure her that the medication would prevent the old man from remembering that night. Emily immediately called Jonathan from the emergency stairwell. The attorney told her not to confront Victoria and to photograph anyone who left the room. Minutes later, The man with the folder emerged into the corridor. Emily captured his face with her phone. When she returned to the room, Richard appeared to be asleep. Victoria was smiling as she placed several papers into her handbag. She said the old man had voluntarily signed a temporary authorization. Emily approached the bed and saw an ink stain on Richard's finger, but also a strangely serene expression. When they were alone, he opened his eyes. He had forgotten nothing. He had pretended to be more sedated than he truly was, so that he could hear the entire plan. Then he whispered that he now knew who was willing to destroy the legacy, and who had remained to protect it, without asking for a reward. 2 days later, Richard returned to the estate under medical supervision. He secretly called Jonathan and ordered that the final will be signed outside Madrid, before independent witnesses and after a capacity evaluation. Emily did not attend the meeting. Richard asked her to visit her mother in Toledo, an excuse she accepted without suspecting anything. Meanwhile, Victoria searched the old man's study and did not find the document. Her frustration became hatred toward Emily. She was convinced Emily was the beneficiary, although she had no proof. When Emily returned, she found another check on her bed and a note. "Take this and disappear before it is too late." Emily kept the note, tore up the check, and went downstairs to prepare Richard's dinner, unaware that every act of dignity was confirming the decision he had just placed in writing. Mr. Richard's handwriting trembled across the page, but every word retained the authority that had dominated boardrooms for decades. Emily began reading aloud. "If you are hearing this, it means they tried to remove you before you learned the truth. Do not reproach them for their fear. Those who have built their power upon a lie always fear the person who preserves the evidence." Victoria gave a nervous laugh and dismissed the letter as sentimental theater. Although the color had drained from her face, Jonathan asked her not to interrupt. Emily continued reading while the small key rested beside her glass. "Before revealing my final decision, 3 questions must be answered. Not because I do not know the answers, but because I want those who betrayed me to have one last opportunity to confess before the people they also deceived." Alexander sat down slowly. Claire placed her napkin on the table, ready to rise. But the notary's security officers still guarded the doors. The first question appeared on a separate line. "Who brought a false notary into my hospital room and tried to obtain my signature while I was under sedation?" Every gaze turned toward Victoria, although no one spoke her name. The matriarch straightened and declared that she had called a professional to protect the family's interests during an emergency. Jonathan opened his folder and explained that the man Emily had photographed that night was not a member of the Madrid Notarial Association and had no authorization to intervene in commercial documents. Victoria replied that she had not known that detail and had trusted a recommendation. Emily asked who had recommended him. For 1 second, Victoria's eyes searched for Claire, but Claire remained motionless. Alexander warned his wife to stop interrogating his mother as though she were guilty. Emily raised the letter and replied that the questions were not hers, but those of the man whose portrait presided over the room. The second question was even more dangerous. Who withdrew money from the Richard Whitmore Foundation through false invoices and transferred it to a consulting firm connected to the Foster Fund? Mr. Lawrence let out a curse. Other shareholders leaned toward Jonathan, demanding to know what amounts were involved. The attorney replied that the preliminary investigation pointed to more than 4 million euros originally intended for employee housing, scholarships, and medical treatment. Claire found her voice and claimed that her family's fund had never received illicit money and that the external consulting firms worked with dozens of companies. Emily watched Alexander avoid her eyes. She remembered the nights when he claimed to be reviewing social projects while she sat beside Richard in the hospital. Mr. Richard had financed those programs for years in memory of his wife. Knowing that someone had turned the old man's generosity into a private cash box slowly transformed Emily's pain into indignation. "That is an extremely serious accusation," Alexander said to Jonathan. "I will not allow the group's reputation to be destroyed by insinuations written by a sick man." The attorney looked at him coldly and asked whether he was questioning his grandfather's mental capacity. Alexander replied that the medication could have altered his perception. Jonathan then produced a certificate signed by a neurologist, a forensic psychiatrist, and Richard's personal physician. All three had evaluated the old man before the testamentary amendment and confirmed that he fully understood his decisions. Victoria accused Jonathan of arranging the examinations behind the family's back. He replied that Richard had acted in secret because he knew someone would try to have him declared incompetent. Claire intervened softly, suggesting that Emily had influenced the old man during months of isolation. Jonathan's expression hardened. Mrs. Carter did not know the contents of the will, did not attend the signing, and was deliberately sent to Toledo that day. The third question in the letter was the one that made Alexander tremble. Who concealed the financial report proving that the Foster investment would not save the group, but would allow it to be dismantled and its most valuable properties sold? Mr. Richard added that the original document had disappeared from his study, but that he had kept a copy in a safe place. Claire denied that such a report existed. She explained that the agreement with her fund guaranteed liquidity, international expansion, and thousands of jobs. Mr. Lawrence replied that he had never seen the complete clauses, only a presentation prepared by Alexander. Other board members admitted the same. The heir rose, struck the table, and insisted that he had acted to modernize a company trapped in his grandfather's ideas. Emily recognized in his voice the same impatience that appeared whenever Richard asked him for caution. He was no longer defending a business decision. He was defending his need to prove that he could surpass the old man, even if doing so meant surrendering everything he had received. Victoria demanded that Emily hand over the letter. She extended her hand and declared that, as Richard's daughter, she had the right to review any accusation against the family. Emily carefully folded the document and returned it to the envelope. "When you took away my chair, you said I was not part of this family," she said. "Now you want to use the word family to seize what was addressed to me." A murmur of approval rose among several guests, something Victoria could never have imagined at the beginning of the dinner. Furious, she signaled one of the estate's security employees, but he looked toward Jonathan and did not move. Alexander walked around the table and stopped in front of Emily. In a low voice, he asked her not to turn the matter into a public war. She replied that the war had begun long before, when everyone decided her silence meant weakness. "Give me the envelope and we will talk at home," he insisted. Emily looked directly at him. "Which home, Alexander? The one your mistress is already planning to renovate?" Claire stood abruptly and denied ever entering Emily's bedroom. From the doorway, Martha said she had heard Claire speaking with Victoria about changing the curtains, removing the antique furniture, and converting the dressing room into a larger room. Claire accused the housekeeper of lying out of loyalty to Emily. Martha replied that she had served the family since before Claire had learned to pronounce the Whitmore name. Alexander demanded that everyone be silent, but Emily had already removed the gold button she had found months earlier from her handbag. She placed it on the tablecloth in front of Claire. The mistress recognized it, although she pretended indifference. Emily explained where she had found it and showed the magazine photograph on her phone, in which the matching piece was missing from Claire's jacket. Victoria tried to ridicule the evidence, saying thousands of garments used similar buttons. Claire, however, made the mistake of replying that she had lost that button in Barcelona. No one had mentioned the city. The silence that followed was more humiliating than any shout. Alexander closed his eyes for an instant, aware that he could no longer sustain the lie. Emily asked how long he had been deceiving her. He replied that their marriage had been broken for months, and that Claire had appeared when he needed someone capable of understanding his responsibilities. Emily remembered every night she had spent caring for Alexander's grandfather while he claimed to be working. Every time she had surrendered her salary, her colleagues, and her own life because he insisted the family needed her. "You did not look for someone who understood your responsibilities," she said. "You looked for someone who praised your ambitions and never reminded you of what you were destroying." Alexander replied that Emily had always placed herself morally above everyone else. She calmly shook her head. "I was never above anyone. You were the one who chose to leave me alone, so you could feel greater beside another woman." Claire used the pain as an opening to attack. She declared that Emily was using a private infidelity to distract the shareholders from the real issue. A woman with no corporate experience could be attempting to seize a fortune. She asked who benefited most from the letter, the key, and the suspicions cast upon everyone. Emily replied that she still did not know what the inheritance contained, and that, unlike Claire, she had not come to the dinner dressed to occupy another wife's place. Victoria intervened, insisting that even if Richard had left Emily money, she had no right to interfere in the company. Jonathan pointed to the key on the table. It did not belong to a household box, but to a safe deposit vault rented by Mr. Richard at a private bank. The card included joint authorization. Emily could access the contents only while accompanied by him. Richard had ensured that no one could force her to open it alone, or later accuse her of altering the evidence. The matriarch objected to their leaving the estate, arguing that the reading had to end there. Jonathan explained that the next phase required access to the box that very night. The bank had agreed, under Richard's contractual instructions, to keep a special office open until midnight. If Emily did not appear, the contents would be transferred to the commercial court first thing in the morning. Victoria looked at the clock. It was 10:20. Alexander wanted to accompany them, but the document authorized only Emily and Jonathan. Mr. Lawrence demanded to go as the shareholders' representative. Jonathan agreed that he could wait outside the vault. Claire asked to speak privately with Alexander, but Victoria moved first and whispered something in her ear. Emily managed to distinguish two words: original report. She understood that the family did not fear only the will, but a specific piece of evidence capable of revealing how they had emptied the foundation and compromised the company. 20 minutes later, a caravan of vehicles left the estate. Emily rode in Jonathan's car with the letter resting on her knees. Madrid appeared beyond the window as a succession of rain-slicked lights. The attorney asked whether she wanted to stop. She replied that she had spent too long stopped already, waiting for Alexander to become the man who had promised to protect her. Jonathan was silent before confessing that Mr. Richard had spoken about her during the signing of the will. He did not reveal the contents, but said the old man regretted allowing Emily to sacrifice her profession while everyone else benefited from her work. He knew that caring for a sick person did not make you a woman without ambition, Jonathan explained. He knew they had made you invisible, because receiving your loyalty was more convenient than recognizing its value. Emily looked at the key. For the first time that night, her eyes filled with tears. The bank occupied a discreet building near Paseo de la Castellana. A security director received them in an empty lobby and verified Emily's documents in front of two cameras. Victoria, Alexander, Claire, and the shareholders were required to remain in an outer room separated by glass. Emily saw Claire checking her phone repeatedly. When she tried to make a call, one of the guards asked her to put the device away for reasons of confidentiality. She obeyed, but her expression revealed urgency. Jonathan and Emily descended by elevator to an underground floor. The vault contained rows of unnamed metal compartments. The employee inserted a master key. Emily used Richard's. Inside, they found a heavy black box, secured with a combination written on the final page of the letter: the birth date of Mr. Richard's late wife. The box contained an original shareholder ledger, several folders, a digital drive, and a small recorder. There was also an envelope bearing Alexander's name. Emily did not open it because Jonathan explained that it could only be delivered after the testamentary reading. They examined the ledger first. The entries proved Richard had never validly transferred his block of shares to Alexander. The copies presented months earlier contained substituted pages and a signature obtained during his hospitalization. Another folder showed transfers from the foundation to a consulting firm called Blue Horizon, created 6 months earlier by an administrator connected to Claire's father. Every payment had been authorized using Alexander's executive credentials. Emily felt a hollow sensation in her stomach. She wanted to believe her husband had signed without understanding, but the printed emails contained precise instructions: divide the amounts, avoid internal controls, and present the expenses as international consulting. Jonathan connected the digital drive to an isolated bank computer. The concealed financial report appeared on the screen. Its conclusions were devastating. The foster fund could demand the sale of hotels, historic buildings, and land if the group failed to meet almost impossible targets. Mr. Richard had written comments in the margins accusing Claire and her father of preparing a concealed takeover. He also noted that Alexander had received a personal promise: He would retain the position of president after the restructuring. Emily understood why Claire flattered him, why Victoria supported the relationship, and why everyone needed to expel her before that night. She was not a threat because of her business experience, but because she had been beside Richard when he discovered the plan. Perhaps they feared the old man had told her more than she truly knew. For months, her supposed insignificance had been the only reason no one bothered to hide their conversations in front of her. Finally, Jonathan switched on the recorder. Mr. Richard's weak voice filled the vault. "My name is Richard Whitmore Hayes. I am recording this statement because I fear my family will attempt to invalidate my decisions." He described the false notary, Victoria's pressure, and the transfers authorized by Alexander. He said he had pretended not to understand while they spoke beside his bed. Then he mentioned Emily. "The only person who did not ask me for a signature was the woman everyone called an opportunist. The only person who tried to save the jobs was the woman they considered incapable of understanding the company. That is why I have decided that my shares—" The recording stopped suddenly. The device made a dry sound and returned to the beginning. Emily looked at Jonathan in confusion. He checked the memory and discovered that the final file was missing. Richard had deliberately separated the declaration about the heir from the evidence of criminal conduct. In the outer room, Victoria rose when she saw them return with the box. Alexander demanded to know what they had found. Jonathan replied that there were sufficient indications of document forgery, disloyal administration, and misappropriation of funds. The shareholders began demanding explanations. Alexander denied knowing the true destination of the transfers and claimed Claire had managed the contacts with the consulting firms. She looked at him with sudden hardness. "You authorized every payment," she said. The perfect alliance revealed its first crack. Victoria accused Emily of causing division through documents no one had verified. Jonathan explained that at dawn they would deliver certified copies to the prosecutor's office and the commercial court. Claire approached Alexander and reminded him that if the Foster transaction stopped, the banks might withdraw their support. He replied that first he had to save himself. Emily watched the love they had displayed in her own chair dissolve at the possibility of losing power. While everyone argued, Claire asked permission to use the restroom. A guard escorted her into the hallway, but allowed her to enter alone. She closed the door, removed a second phone hidden inside her handbag, and called a memorized number. She spoke quickly and quietly. She ordered that every document connected to Blue Horizon be removed from the banking archive, and that the backup of Richard's recording be destroyed before 8 in the morning. The person on the other end warned that access required executive authorization. Claire replied that Alexander's credentials should be used, because after that night he would make the perfect culprit. She did not know that Martha, sent by Emily to find water, had entered the hallway and was listening behind the partly open door. The housekeeper pressed her phone against her chest and activated the audio recording with trembling hands. When Claire returned to the room, her face had regained its composure. She approached Alexander and assured him they would find a way to prove Mr. Richard had been manipulated. Emily watched her and wondered how anyone could lie with such calm. At that moment, Martha appeared at the far end of the hallway. She said nothing. She merely held Emily's gaze and discreetly touched the pocket where she kept the phone. Emily understood that something had happened. Jonathan closed the box and announced that they would return to the estate to safeguard the evidence until the authorities arrived. Victoria declared that no police officer would enter her father's house. Emily replied that the house might never have belonged to her. The matriarch lunged toward her, but Alexander stopped her for the first time. He did not do it to protect Emily, but because he knew any assault in front of witnesses would worsen his position. Before leaving the bank, Jonathan gave Emily a copy of the final page of the letter. There, Mr. Richard had written, "The identity of the person who will receive my shares is contained in the original will deposited in Toledo. Do not trust any copy presented in Madrid." Victoria managed to read the word Toledo, and her expression changed. Emily remembered that the old man had sent her to visit her mother precisely on the day of the signing. Richard had not merely protected the document. He had created an alibi to prevent anyone from accusing Emily of influencing him. Jonathan explained that he would travel to Toledo at dawn to collect the will from the notary who held it. Victoria remained silent, but Claire immediately understood there was still an opportunity to stop him. As they walked toward the cars, her eyes met the matriarch's. They did not need to speak. Both knew that if the document reached the shareholders' meeting, the chair taken from Emily would be the least of their losses. The return to the Whitmore estate brought no calm, but an open declaration of war. Before Jonathan could secure the documents in Mr. Richard's study, Victoria gathered the relatives in the drawing room and announced that Emily had manipulated a sick old man in order to seize his fortune. Her voice trembled enough to make her seem wounded, but not enough to cost her authority. She claimed the letter, the key, and the recordings could have been prepared by anyone with access to Richard's room. Claire reinforced the accusation by reminding everyone that Emily had worked restoring old documents and therefore possessed the knowledge to imitate inks, papers, and signatures. The insinuation spread quickly through the house. What had been an insignificant profession to them for years now became the perfect weapon for presenting her as a forger. Emily listened without defending herself. She understood that every truth uncovered would force her enemies to invent a larger lie. Alexander found her in the corridor leading to Richard's former study. His tie was loosened, and his face had been hardened by fear. He asked her to enter the library with him so they could speak alone. On the table, he had prepared 2 documents, a petition for divorce by mutual consent, and a waiver of every financial right connected to the Whitmore family. In return, he offered an apartment in Madrid, a monthly allowance, and a sum large enough that Emily would never have to work again. Alexander insisted it was the only way to avoid a public process that would destroy them both. He also promised not to accuse her of manipulating his grandfather if she handed over the envelope, the key, and every copy of the evidence. Emily went through the pages slowly. Every clause protected Alexander, Victoria, and the foster group. She was required to waive even the right to report facts discovered during the marriage. This was not a divorce. It was the advance purchase of her silence. "We can still end this without hurting each other," Alexander said, pushing a pen toward her. Emily raised her eyes and asked when Claire had become included among the people in that "we" he claimed to protect. He replied that his relationship with Claire was insignificant compared with the future of thousands of employees. Emily pointed to the transfers stolen from the foundation and asked how many families had lost aid to finance that supposed future. Alexander lost his patience. He struck the table and claimed she did not understand how large companies worked, that sometimes money had to be moved to secure important operations. Emily picked up the documents, tore them in half, and let the pieces fall at his feet. "You are not offering me freedom," she said. "You are asking me to sign a lie so you can keep calling what you did strategy." Alexander stared at the torn papers, and his expression changed. The husband who had once apologized disappeared. Only the cornered heir remained. "Then you will leave tonight," he ordered. Emily reminded him that ownership of the estate had not yet been determined, but Alexander replied that as long as he directed the company and paid the staff, no one would obey her instructions. He led her into the entrance hall and summoned 2 security employees. Martha protested, saying Mr. Richard had expressly ordered that Emily remain in the house until the final reading. Victoria appeared at the top of the staircase and replied that her father was dead and could no longer protect anyone. Emily asked for a few minutes to collect her belongings. Claire offered to accompany her with a poisonous smile, but Emily refused. She went alone to the bedroom where she had lived for 3 years and found drawers open, dresses thrown across the floor, and the mattress lifted. Someone had searched every corner for the recording, the letter, or a copy of the bank documents. Her privacy had been invaded before Alexander had even spoken the word expulsion. Emily placed a few clothes, the gold button, and Richard's handwritten notes inside the old handbag. When she opened the inner compartment, she noticed that the secondary phone on which she had photographed documents during the old man's illness was missing. Claire appeared in the doorway and admitted without evasion that hiding evidence was no longer useful. She said that by dawn, the newspapers would report that Emily had emotionally seduced a vulnerable man to obtain an inheritance. She also claimed a doctor would confirm that Richard had suffered episodes of confusion. Emily asked how much they had paid for that testimony. Claire smiled. Less than what you expected to receive from the will. Then she stepped closer and whispered that Alexander would never choose a woman who reminded him of his mistakes. Emily replied that Claire had not been chosen for love either, but because she knew how to turn an insecure man's ambition into a leash. The mistress's smile disappeared for an instant. It was enough to reveal that the words had found a real wound. When Emily came downstairs with her suitcase, several journalists were waiting outside the main entrance. Victoria had deliberately leaked her expulsion. Camera flashes lit her face, as questions overlapped. Had she forged the will? Was she having a secret relationship with Jonathan? Had she administered medication to Richard without authorization? Emily understood that the campaign was already underway. She did not answer. She walked toward Martha's car, but a police vehicle stopped beside the gate. 2 officers approached and explained that they had received a complaint alleging theft of corporate documents and unauthorized access to financial records. Alexander remained beneath the portico, unable to look at her. Claire held his arm, as though she were already mistress of the house. Emily handed over her handbag for inspection. Inside, the officers found several sheets bearing Whitmore Group seals that she had never placed there. Claire had planted the documents during the search of the bedroom. Jonathan arrived before they could take Emily away. He demanded to see the warrant and explained that the supposedly stolen pages belonged to Mr. Richard's personal archive, not the company. Even so, the officers had to take her in to give a statement. Victoria approached with feigned sadness and said she regretted seeing Emily end that way. Emily held her gaze and replied that the most dangerous part of a lie was not repeating it, but believing no one would preserve the memory of the truth. As she was led toward the police car, Martha pushed through the journalists, embraced Emily, and discreetly slipped a small device into the pocket of her coat. It was the recording of Claire's phone call from the bank. Mr. Richard taught me that a house can have many cameras and still fail to see what matters, she whispered. But this time, someone listened. Emily squeezed her hand without speaking. For the first time since the night began, she possessed a piece of evidence her enemies did not know about. At the police station, Jonathan presented the notarized documentation, authorizing Emily to temporarily hold the copies. He also handed over Martha's recording. Claire's voice could be heard clearly ordering the destruction of files, the use of Alexander's credentials, and the later effort to make him the culprit. The inspector suspended the accusation against Emily and opened proceedings into possible evidence tampering. However, Jonathan warned that the recording alone might not be enough to arrest Claire if the defense challenged the manner in which it had been obtained. They needed to protect Richard's backup before it was destroyed and recover the original will in Toledo. Emily wanted to accompany him, but he refused. Someone had to go to the group's headquarters first thing in the morning to prevent Victoria and Alexander from approving new transfers. Moreover, if Emily disappeared from Madrid, the shareholders might interpret it as flight.
See.
Jonathan promised to return with the notary before the extraordinary meeting scheduled for noon. News of Emily's temporary detention appeared on digital news sites before dawn. Victoria gave a carefully prepared statement in which she presented herself as a betrayed daughter. She claimed that Richard had been surrounded by interested people during his final months, and that the family sought only to protect his memory. Claire, standing beside her, declared that she had never wished to take Emily's place, and that her relationship with Alexander had begun only after the marriage was already broken. Neither woman mentioned the millions taken from the foundation. Neither explained the recorded call from the bank. Alexander appeared behind them without speaking. His silence, which had once condemned Emily, was beginning to condemn him. Claire had used his credentials and was prepared to abandon him if the evidence advanced. Victoria, by contrast, still trusted that her son would retain control of the company. Both needed the shareholders' meeting to end before Jonathan returned. At 7 in the morning, Emily received a call from the clinic where Richard had been treated. A physician named Dr. Wallace wanted to speak with her privately. They met in a cafe near the hospital. The man looked exhausted and avoided her eyes. He confessed that Victoria had offered him money to sign a retrospective report claiming Richard had suffered cognitive decline. At first, he refused, but Claire threatened to report an old administrative negligence that could cost him his license. The doctor had yielded, and the false report was to be presented during the shareholders' meeting. Emily asked him to tell the truth before a notary. Dr. Wallace feared losing everything. She replied that Richard had entrusted his life to doctors and that using his illness to steal his will was worse than any professional error. The man remained silent, took the false report from his briefcase, and tore it up in front of her. Then he agreed to accompany her. Meanwhile, Martha secretly returned to the estate. She knew service passages and forgotten rooms Victoria had never used. She entered Mr. Richard's bedroom and removed a loose board behind the bookcase. There she found a notebook containing dates, names, and notes written during the old man's final weeks. Richard had recorded every visit from Victoria, every document presented to him, and every dose of medication. On one page, he described how he had pretended to sleep while his daughter and the false notary discussed the transfer of shares. On another, he noted that Alexander knew about the plan, although he had not entered the room. The final sentence read, "Emily must know that I am not leaving her a reward, but a responsibility. Perhaps one day she will hate me for placing her in the middle of this war, but she is the only person who does not wish to win it for herself." Martha photographed every page and hid the notebook beneath her uniform before leaving the house. At 9, Emily arrived at Whitmore Group headquarters, accompanied by Dr. Wallace and an attorney from Jonathan's team. The employees watched her with distrust, fed by the morning headlines. Some looked away. Others whispered that she had tried to take the company. Emily requested access to the Foundation archive, but her card had been deactivated. Alexander had ordered all her credentials blocked and forbidden her entry to the executive floors. From the lobby, she watched Richard's portrait being removed from the main hall so a screen displaying the new Foster expansion plan could be installed. The company was changing owners before the will had even been read. Emily called Mr. Lawrence and explained that the meeting could not begin before the legitimacy of the shares was verified. He replied that Victoria had presented a copy of a will naming Alexander as heir and that several shareholders were prepared to vote. Claire had arranged the stage with precision. The extraordinary meeting would take place in the grand auditorium of the corporate tower. Before the press, they would announce Alexander's confirmation as permanent president, the official entry of the Foster Fund, and, as a symbol of family stability, the engagement of Alexander and Claire once the divorce was complete. Emily understood that they did not merely seek control of the company. They intended to transform her public humiliation into a coronation. Victoria wanted everyone to see Claire occupy the wife's place again, this time not at a table, but before hundreds of employees and shareholders. Alexander called Emily from a private number and offered her one final opportunity to withdraw her accusations and disappear before noon. She asked whether he truly intended to announce his engagement, only hours after expelling her. Alexander replied that the company needed an image of unity. Emily closed her eyes. "You never loved unity," she said. "You only loved any image in which you appeared powerful." At 10:30, Jonathan called from the road. The Toledo notary had received a false court order attempting to prevent delivery of the will. Someone had also caused a breakdown in the notarial archives vehicle. Jonathan obtained a certified copy, but his return would be delayed. Emily informed him that the vote would begin at noon. The attorney asked her to buy time and not enter the auditorium alone if Victoria had mobilized security. Emily replied that she had spent 3 years entering rooms alone, where everyone wanted her to remain silent. Then she met Martha, who had just arrived with Richard's notebook. Dr. Wallace verified the medical notes and confirmed that they matched the actual doses. Together, they prepared copies. It was not yet the final will, but it was enough evidence to challenge the validity of the document Victoria had presented. Emily knew her enemies would try to remove her before she could speak. At 11:50, the shareholders took their seats. Victoria wore black and her mother's pearls. Claire wore a white suit that seemed chosen for a wedding ceremony. Alexander waited on the stage in front of the company logo. The central chair that had belonged to Mr. Richard for decades had been placed for him. When Emily appeared at the entrance, the head of security blocked her path. He displayed an internal order signed by Alexander, declaring her unauthorized because of the theft investigation. Emily explained that the accusation had been suspended, but the man replied that he was following instructions. The journalist's cameras turned toward her. Claire watched from the stage with contained satisfaction. Victoria took the microphone and announced that a person outside the family was attempting to disrupt a legitimate meeting. The same phrase used to take Emily's chair at the estate was now being used to close the doors of the empire to her. Emily raised Richard's notebook and declared that she possessed evidence concerning the false notary, the medication, and the transfers. Victoria ordered the meeting to begin. Alexander hesitated for several seconds, but finally instructed security to remove his wife. Two men advanced. Martha stepped between them and shouted that she had served Mr. Richard for 35 years and that no one could call him incompetent after she had heard him beg them to protect his will. Dr. Wallace raised his credentials and announced before the cameras that the report alleging dementia had been falsified under pressure from Victoria Whitmore and Claire Foster. The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Claire accused him of lying to avoid a lawsuit. Dr. Wallace replied that he was prepared to testify before a judge. Victoria lost her composure and demanded that they all be expelled. Alexander remained beside his grandfather's chair, trapped between the truth and his final opportunity to obtain the position he had always desired. "Begin the vote!" Victoria ordered. The secretary read the proposal, recognizing Alexander as holder of Mr. Richard's block of shares, according to the copy presented by the family. Several shareholders raised their hands. Others hesitated after hearing the doctor. Emily tried to advance, but security held her by the arms. Claire then took the microphone and declared that the Foster Fund would withdraw its investment unless immediate stability was guaranteed. It was a direct threat: vote for Alexander or accept a financial crisis. Mr. Lawrence rose and demanded to see the original will. Victoria replied that it was held by the family and that the copy was fully valid. At that moment, the auditorium doors opened from outside. Jonathan Sawyer entered, accompanied by a white-haired woman, two notarial officials, and several agents from the Economic Crimes Unit. In his hands, he carried a red folder sealed with the emblem of the Notarial Association of Castilla-La Mancha. "Any vote cast from this moment forward will be null," Jonathan declared. "The document presented by Victoria Whitmore is not Mr. Richard's final will." The woman accompanying him introduced herself as Amelia Turner, a notary from Toledo, and a direct witness to the final signing. She confirmed that Richard had been examined by specialists, that he had acted without relatives present, and that he had left instructions intended to prevent precisely that meeting. One of the agents asked Claire to surrender her phones. She tried to leave through a side door, but Martha pointed out that she carried a second device hidden in her handbag. Alexander looked at Claire and understood that the bank recording was real, and that she had planned to use his credentials to place all responsibility on him. Victoria came down from the stage and tried to snatch the folder from Jonathan. The officials stepped between them. For the first time, the matriarch looked like an ordinary woman, terrified by a piece of paper she could not control. Jonathan turned to the head of security and asked who had ordered Emily barred from entry. Alexander admitted that he had. The attorney raised the sealed will and replied, "Then you have just denied access to the shareholder with the greatest ownership, right in this room." At first, no one reacted. The words seemed too large to be understood. Claire denied that it was possible. Victoria insisted Richard would never have handed the company to a stranger. Notary Amelia Turner opened her register and confirmed that Emily Carter Bennett was listed as the principal beneficiary of Mr. Richard's personal block of shares, subject to the complete reading of his provisions. The head of security immediately released Emily's arms. The shareholders rose. The cameras captured Alexander's devastated face as he looked at the woman he had expelled from his home and tried to buy with an apartment. Emily walked down the center aisle without hurrying. She wore the same clothes as the night before, carried the leather handbag at her side, and held Richard's notebook in her hands. As she passed Claire, the woman murmured that a will could be challenged, and that she would never allow a caregiver to control her investment. Emily replied that the company was not Claire's to allow anything. When she reached the stage, she did not immediately take Mr. Richard's chair. She placed her handbag on the main table directly in front of Alexander, just as she had placed the envelope in front of the plate Victoria had taken from her. Jonathan set the red folder beside it. The notary called for silence so the reading could begin. Victoria searched for support among the relatives, but no one approached her. Claire looked toward the exits guarded by the agents. Alexander lowered his head. The truth had not yet been read in full, but for the first time, everyone understood who would have to leave the table. Notary Amelia Turner placed the original will on the table and asked everyone to remain silent. Her voice was not loud, but it crossed the auditorium with the firmness of a judgment. She explained that Mr. Richard had signed the document 4 days before his final hospitalization, after completing 2 medical evaluations and before witnesses with no connection to either the family or the business group. She also placed on record that none of the named beneficiaries had known the contents. Victoria tried to interrupt, insisting her father had been manipulated by fear and illness. But Amelia raised an additional sheet, a declaration written by Richard in which he had anticipated that exact accusation. "If my daughter Victoria claims that I was not in full possession of my faculties," she read, "remember that she was the person who attempted to obtain my signature while I was sedated." The room became motionless. Victoria stopped protesting. For the first time, her own name was joined to betrayal in a document that could not be hidden. Amelia continued with the distribution of the personal assets. Minor properties would be divided among several grandchildren, former employees, and charitable organizations. Martha received a home in Madrid and a lifetime pension in recognition of her 35 years of service. She covered her mouth with one hand, unable to contain her tears. Richard also left a sum intended to recover the group's historical collection and return it to the public archive where Emily had worked. However, when the notary reached the principal block of shares, she paused. The Whitmores seemed to lean forward at the same time. "I bequeath all my personal holdings in Whitmore Group, equivalent to 41% of its capital and its controlling rights, to Emily Carter Bennett." An explosion of voices swept through the auditorium. Claire stood and shouted that it was absurd. Alexander clutched the back of his grandfather's chair. Emily did not move. She had imagined many truths inside the envelope, but not a responsibility capable of changing her life so irreversibly. The notary raised a hand and clarified that the inheritance included conditions. Emily was required to preserve the employment fund for 5 years, restore the money diverted from the foundation, and submit the group's principal operations to an independent committee. Mr. Richard had not given her the shares to enrich her, but because he considered her the only person close to him who had defended the legacy without attempting to possess it. In a paragraph written personally, Richard explained that Emily had reviewed documents, detected manipulated contracts, and warned him about the foster transaction without requesting a position, a salary, or a reward. He also recalled that during his illness, she had refused 3 times to accept money from Victoria in exchange for leaving the family. "The woman they called an opportunist," he wrote, "was the only person who never placed a price on her loyalty." Many shareholders lowered their eyes in shame. Emily felt as though the old man were speaking to her again, from the room where she had held his hand through so many nights. Alexander asked what portion belonged to him. His voice sounded lower than ever. Amelia read the clause addressed to the grandson. He would retain 1 residence, part of his personal investments, and a minority package of shares, but would lose every executive function for 10 years. To recover a position in the future, he had to cooperate with the investigation into the diverted funds and prove that he had not deliberately participated in document forgery. If he refused, he would lose even those shares. Mr. Richard had added a private letter, which Jonathan handed to Alexander. He opened it with trembling hands and managed to read only the first lines before letting it fall. Emily saw the sentence written in blue ink. "You did not disappoint me by making mistakes, but by allowing others to be punished in order to protect your pride." Alexander closed his eyes. He had spent years trying to prove himself worthy of the Whitmore name, and his grandfather had just revealed that the name was not enough to make him an heir. The clause intended for Victoria was harsher still. Richard removed all her voting rights over his shares and revoked every power granted during his illness. She could retain a personal allowance and live in a smaller property, provided she cooperated with the authorities. The family estate would be incorporated into a foundation under Emily's control, and that of the new committee. Victoria gave a desperate laugh and declared that her father could not expel her from the house in which she had grown up. Amelia replied that the estate had never belonged to her. For decades, Victoria had behaved as its owner because no one had dared remind her that she merely administered what Richard permitted. Emily looked at the woman who had forced her to rise from the table only hours earlier. She no longer seemed like an invincible matriarch, but someone who had just discovered that all her authority depended on papers she had never read, and a father she had believed too weak to defend himself. Claire tried to leave the auditorium, while attention remained on Victoria. 2 economic crimes agents blocked her path and requested her phones. She protested, invoked the attorneys of the foster fund, and claimed no recording obtained without consent could justify detention. Jonathan replied that the case did not rest only on the call Martha had recorded. The backup Claire had ordered destroyed had already been recovered by the bank and delivered that morning. The records showed that she used Alexander's credentials to authorize transfers, delete files, and send instructions to Blue Horizon. In addition, the administrator of the consulting firm had agreed to cooperate in exchange for judicial protection. Claire looked at Alexander and pointed out that every decision had been approved by him. Alexander replied that she had assured him the payments were legal commissions. The alliance born among hotels, private dinners, and promises of power ended as 2 desperate people trying to place the blame on each other. Jonathan connected Mr. Richards' complete recording to the auditorium system. This time, the file did not stop. The old man's voice sounded weak but clear. He described how Victoria had entered his room with the false notary, how he pretended to be confused so he could hear the conversation, and how Alexander waited outside, knowing they were trying to transfer the shares. Richard clarified that his grandson had not designed the plan, but knew enough to stop it and chose to remain silent. Then he spoke about Claire and the foster fund, explaining that they intended to divide the group, sell its historic properties, and dismiss hundreds of employees. Finally, he mentioned Emily. "I do not choose her because she cared for me. I choose her because, when she discovered irregularities, she tried to protect people whose names she did not even know. A person who defends strangers when no one is watching understands a company better than someone who knows only how to watch the value of its shares." No one could answer those words. Victoria moved toward the stage and pointed at Emily with a trembling finger. She accused her of stealing her father's love and taking advantage of an old man's loneliness. She said Richard had always been harsh with his own daughter, while treating Emily as though she were the perfect heir. Emily listened without interrupting. When Victoria finished, Emily replied that no one could steal an affection Victoria herself had despised. She recalled the dinners at which Richard waited for a visit that never came, the birthdays marked by 5-minute phone calls, and the hospital nights when Victoria asked only about pending documents. "He did not leave me the shares because I was better than you," Emily said. "He left them to me because you turned every gesture of love into a negotiation." Victoria raised a hand to strike her, but Martha stepped between them. This time, everyone present saw the violence that had remained hidden behind the estate's doors for years. The agents asked Victoria to accompany them to give a statement concerning the false notary, the pressure placed on Dr. Wallace, and the possible forgery of testamentary documents. She refused, shouting that the Whitmore name stood above any accusation. Mr. Lawrence, who had obeyed her decisions for years, rose and replied that no family stood above the law. Other shareholders supported Alexander's immediate suspension and the cancellation of the foster transaction. The vote was nearly unanimous. Emily did not celebrate when the secretary announced the result. She knew thousands of employees depended on the decisions made after the scandal. Her first order, as principal shareholder, was to freeze all dismissals, secure the financial archives, and guarantee that salaries continued to be paid. Her second was to open every foundation account to an external audit. Her third was to remove the Whitmore name from the public statement and speak only of individual responsibility. Claire finally lost her composure. She approached Emily and whispered that she would not last 6 months at the head of such a complex company. She reminded her that she had no executive experience, no international contacts, and none of the cruelty required to survive among investors. Emily replied that cruelty was precisely what had brought the group to the edge of destruction. She did not intend to lead alone or pretend to know what she did not know. She would hire independent professionals, listen to the workers, and bring back those who had been removed for questioning Alexander. Claire mocked that vision as naive. Emily looked toward the agents waiting beside the door. Perhaps the naive thing was believing every person could be bought. Claire was escorted out of the auditorium between cameras and journalists. The white suit she had chosen to announce her victory became the public image of her fall. When the room began to empty, Alexander remained beside Mr. Richards' chair. No one approached him. Emily gathered her handbag and the letters, ready to leave. But he called to her. He walked toward her with a devastated face and, before the few shareholders who remained, dropped to his knees. He said he had made mistakes, that Claire had fed his ambition, and that Victoria had raised him to believe love was weakness. He insisted he still loved Emily and asked for an opportunity to repair the marriage. She watched him in silence. For years, she had imagined hearing those words. Now she understood they had arrived only when he had nothing left to offer her except regret. "You did not lose me when you met Claire," she replied. "You lost me the night your mother removed my chair, and you decided defending me might cost you too much. Love that appears only when power disappears is not love. It is fear of being left alone." Alexander tried to take her hand, but Emily stepped back. She told him to cooperate with justice, return what had been stolen, and learn to live without a woman correcting the consequences of his decisions. She did not hate him, but she would not allow forgiveness to be confused with reconciliation. Jonathan handed Alexander a copy of the divorce petition Emily had prepared. It requested no compensation or property beyond what legally belonged to her. It demanded only freedom and the return of the personal belongings Claire had searched through. Alexander looked at the documents and remembered the agreement he had tried to force her to sign only hours earlier. This time, there was no check on the table. Emily was not selling her silence. She was recovering her name. He signed the acknowledgement of receipt without argument. As Emily walked away, Alexander remained kneeling before the chair he would never occupy. The investigations that followed confirmed that Claire and her father had designed a concealed acquisition through conditional loans. Blue Horizon had received millions of euros from the foundation and transferred part of the money to accounts used to purchase support within the board. Victoria was charged with coercion, forgery, and obstruction of evidence. The false notary agreed to testify and revealed that she had promised him a substantial sum if he succeeded in obtaining Richard's signature. Alexander avoided a more serious charge by cooperating, surrendering emails, and admitting that he knew part of the plan. He lost his position, his privileges, and most of his friends. For months, he worked with the auditors to return the funds and answer to the employees. He received no quick redemption. Emily refused to turn his guilt into a sentimental story. Some wounds could be forgiven without allowing the person responsible to return to the place where they had caused them. Emily's first decision regarding the estate surprised everyone. She did not move into the master bedroom or remove the family portraits. She transformed part of the building into a support center for women suffering economic and psychological abuse within marriage. There they would receive legal advice, temporary accommodation, and help recovering their professional independence. The former room where Victoria had left checks to buy Emily's silence became an employment guidance office. Emily also returned to the historical archive, not as a full-time employee, but as president of a foundation that financed the restoration of business and family documents. She wanted other stories to survive the people who tried to alter them. Martha agreed to manage the house during the transition, this time with a fair contract and the freedom to retire whenever she wished. For the first time, the estate stopped resembling a monument to wealth and began becoming a useful place. The group endured difficult months, but it did not collapse. Emily appointed an independent board and refused to assume the position of chief executive until she obtained the necessary training. That decision, which Claire would have considered weakness, restored the trust of employees and investors. The foundation's money was recovered through the sale of personal assets belonging to those responsible. The housing and scholarship projects began operating again. Emily visited factories, hotels, and offices without announcing herself. She spoke with workers and asked which decisions by management had harmed their lives. She discovered that governing did not mean possessing every answer, but allowing the truth to reach the table before anyone signed. Whenever someone called her Mrs. Whitmore, she corrected them politely. She was still Emily Carter. She had inherited shares, not an identity. The name once used to diminish her could no longer define the place she occupied. 1 year later, Emily organized a dinner in memory of Mr. Richard, in the same dining room where Victoria had humiliated her. She invited no journalists and no powerful families. Around the table sat longtime workers, foundation doctors, scholarship students, and women helped by the new center. Martha occupied a place of honor. The chair beside Richard's portrait remained empty, with his cane resting against the back and an untouched glass of wine before it. Emily carried the old leather handbag and placed the original letter inside it, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder of the night she decided not to leave the room. Before dinner began, she read one sentence from Richard. "A table does not belong to the person who decides who may sit there, but to the person who ensures that no one must stand up because they lack money, a name, or power." Many remained silent. Others cried without shame. Victoria did not attend. She lived in a smaller property while awaiting trial, and had sent several letters asking to speak with Emily. For months, Emily did not answer. Eventually, she agreed to a visit in the presence of attorneys. Victoria arrived without jewelry, and without the rigid bearing that had once made her seem invulnerable. She did not apologize immediately. First, she spoke about her childhood, Richard's demands, and her fear of being considered a weak daughter. Emily listened, but did not allow suffering to be used as an excuse. She told Victoria that having been hurt did not give her the right to hurt others. Victoria finally admitted that she had hated Emily because Richard trusted her in a way he had never trusted his own family. Emily replied that trust was not inherited. It was built. There was no embrace and no complete reconciliation, only a late truth and the beginning of a responsibility Victoria would have to accept without privilege. Alexander wrote as well. He did not ask to return. He said he had begun therapy, that he worked at a small consulting firm, and that for the first time, no one knew his family name before evaluating his work. He admitted that for years he had confused admiration with love and obedience with respect. Emily read the letter once and placed it beside the divorce documents. She did not answer until weeks later. She wrote that she hoped he would change for himself, not to win her back. She wished him a life in which he did not need to humiliate anyone in order to feel important. Then she sealed the envelope and felt something she had not felt since the wedding: peace. It was not the perfect happiness of fairy tales, but the calm of someone who no longer waits for another person to recognize her worth. She had lost a marriage, a home, and the image of a family, but she had recovered the ability to choose what kind of woman she wished to be. At the end of the anniversary dinner, a young woman from the center asked Emily why she had not used her power to completely destroy the people who had humiliated her. Emily looked at Richard's empty chair and replied that justice did not need to become cruelty in order to be firm. Victoria, Claire, and Alexander had to answer for their decisions. But she would not allow hatred to direct the life she had just recovered. Then she held the handbag containing the will and remembered the moment she had been forced to rise from the table. At the time, she had believed losing a chair meant losing her place. Now she knew dignity did not depend on where someone allowed her to sit, but on the strength to remain standing when everyone expected her to fall. Inherited power could disappear with a signature. Respect, however, belonged only to the person who proved worthy of it when no one was watching.